Good evening. Tonight, we step into a world where a single shop on a cobblestone street held the power of life and death in equal measure. Where behind wooden counters lined with ceramic jars, men in long robes ground substances that could cure a fever or stop a heart. Where the difference between medicine and poison was often just a matter of intention. This is the story of the medieval apothecary, the keeper of secrets, the mixer of remedies, and sometimes the silent killer. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we explore here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this community spread across the world. Now, dim the lights, silence your devices, and let's enter the shadowed doorway of the medieval apothecary shop. The ancient roots of a medieval profession. The story of the medieval apothecary does not begin in the Middle Ages at all. Like so many threads in the intricate cloth of European civilization, it stretches back through the mists of time to the ancient world, to civilizations that rose and fell millennia before the first Gothic cathedral pierced a European sky. To understand the apothecary who stood in his shop in 13th century Paris or 15th century Florence, grinding minerals with a bronze pestle while a nobleman waited for a remedy, we must first journey to a sun-baked city between two rivers. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the land of Sumer where humans first learned to scratch symbols on clay tablets, there existed already a sophisticated understanding of plants and their powers. These were not primitive people fumbling in the dark. Archaeological evidence from around 2600 BCE reveals clay tablets inscribed with medical texts that recorded symptoms, prescriptions, and directions for producing potions and remedies. The earliest pharmacists were priests, for medicine and magic, healing and religion were not yet divorced from one another. In the great ziggurats, those stepped pyramids that dominated the Mesopotamian skyline, priest-physicians maintained stores of medicinal substances. They knew that the bark of the willow tree could ease pain. They understood that certain molds and plant extracts could fight infection, though they could not have explained why in terms we would recognize today. The Sumerians had a particular plant they revered above all others for its medicinal properties. They called it the joy plant, a simple name for the poppy, from whose seed pods oozed a milky latex that, when dried, became opium. This substance could banish pain, induce sleep, and transport the mind to realms beyond the everyday world of suffering. It was, in their understanding, a gift from the gods, and its preparation and administration were sacred duties. Egypt, that ancient kingdom of sand and stone and the eternal Nile, carried these practices forward and codified them with characteristic Egyptian precision. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical document from around 1550 BCE, is a sprawling pharmacological encyclopedia running to over 100 pages. It contains more than 800 formulas and remedies, each meticulously described. The Egyptian physicians, who served the pharaohs and the wealthy elite, were master herbalists. They cultivated gardens specifically for medicinal plants. They knew hundreds of substances, from frankincense and myrrh imported from distant lands to the humble garlic that grew along the Nile's banks. They prepared ointments, salves, pills, and potions. They understood dosing, knowing that the same substance that healed in small amounts could kill in large ones. The city of Thebes became renowned throughout the ancient Mediterranean for the quality of its opium, exported in amphorae to Greece, to Phoenicia, to the far reaches of the known world. The Egyptian pharmacist was a specialist, distinct from the physician. The physician diagnosed and prescribed. The pharmacist prepared and dispensed. This division of labor, this separation of roles, would echo down through the centuries and shape the medieval world. When we speak of ancient pharmacy, however, we must turn our gaze to Greece, for it was the Greeks who transformed empirical knowledge into systematic science. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, who lived in the 5th century BCE, described hundreds of plant-based remedies in his writings. He approached medicine with a rational, observational mind, stripping away much of the religious mysticism that had previously surrounded healing. He taught that diseases had natural causes and natural cures, that the body could be understood through observation and reason. But the true giant of ancient pharmacology was a Greek physician named Dioscorides. In the 1st century of the Common Era, he compiled a work called De Materia Medica, a comprehensive pharmacopoeia that would become the foundation of European medicine for the next 1,500 years. Dioscorides had traveled extensively as a physician in the Roman army, and he brought to his work a breadth of knowledge that was unprecedented. His text described approximately 600 plants and nearly 1,000 drug preparations. Each entry included botanical descriptions, geographical locations where the plant could be found, methods of preparation, and medicinal applications. The cyclamen plant, he wrote, could treat everything from jaundice and headaches to constipation and hair loss. Whether all these claims were accurate is beside the point. What mattered was that Dioscorides created a framework, a systematic approach to cataloging and understanding medicinal substances. The Romans, those great organizers and administrators, took Greek medical knowledge and scaled it to imperial proportions. Galen of Pergamon, physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century, wrote extensively about pharmacy and medicine. He praised opium as the most powerful of all analgesics and perfected complex medicinal preparations called theriac, or antidotes, which contained dozens of ingredients. Under Roman rule, the concept of the specialized drug shop began to emerge in the great cities of the empire. These were not yet the apothecaries of the medieval period, but they were their ancestors. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, this accumulated medical knowledge did not simply vanish. Much of it was preserved, copied, and expanded upon in the Eastern Roman Empire, in Byzantium. But even more crucially, it was preserved and enhanced by the scholars of the Islamic world. The Islamic Golden Age, from roughly the 8th to the 14th centuries, saw an explosion of scientific and medical advancement. Arab, Persian, and Syrian physicians translated the works of Galen and Dioscorides into Arabic, studied them intensely, and added their own observations and discoveries. It was in Baghdad, during the reign of the Abbasid Caliphate, that the world's first true apothecary shops appeared around the year 754. These were sophisticated establishments, regulated by the state, where trained pharmacists prepared and sold medicines according to standardized formulas. The great Persian physician Avicenna, whose real name was Ibn Sina, compiled his monumental work, The Canon of Medicine, around 1025. This encyclopedic text included detailed discussions of hundreds of drugs, their properties, their proper dosages, and their potential dangers. Avicenna was among the first to systematically document addiction, describing how opium could create a terrible craving in those who used it unwisely. By the 11th century, Islamic apothecary shops had spread throughout the Muslim world, from Cordoba in Spain to Cairo in Egypt. They were places of learning as well as commerce, where physicians and scholars gathered to discuss the latest medical theories and where apprentices learned the complex art of drug preparation. The shelves were lined with ceramic jars containing substances from all over the known world: saffron from Persia, cinnamon from Ceylon, ginger from India, frankincense from Arabia. The Islamic apothecaries perfected the art of distillation, creating essential oils and alcohol-based tinctures. They developed new drugs, including camphor and senna, that would become staples of European medicine. This, then, was the inheritance that medieval Europe received. When Christian scholars in places like Toledo began translating Arabic medical texts into Latin in the 12th century, they were not just recovering lost Greek and Roman knowledge. They were accessing centuries of Islamic innovation and refinement. The medieval apothecary would stand on the shoulders of Sumerian priests, Egyptian physicians, Greek scientists, Roman administrators, and Islamic scholars. The shop that opened on a narrow street in a growing European city in the year 1200 was the heir to 4,000 years of accumulated wisdom about the healing and harming powers of the natural world. Monastic medicine, the first medieval apothecaries. When the light of classical learning guttered and nearly died in Western Europe during the chaos that followed Rome's fall, It was the monasteries that kept the flame alive. Behind thick stone walls, in quiet scriptoriums lit by candles and the pale northern sun, monks copied manuscripts. They preserved Dioscorides. They preserved Galen. They preserved Hippocrates. But they did far more than simply preserve. They practiced. They experimented. They cultivated. And in doing so, they became Europe's first medieval apothecaries. The monastery was a world unto itself, a carefully ordered microcosm of the ideal Christian society. Every aspect of life was regulated by the rule of Saint Benedict, or similar monastic codes. Prayer and work filled the hours. Among the works assigned to the brothers was the care of the sick, for Christ himself had commanded his followers to heal the afflicted. Most monasteries maintained an infirmary where sick monks were tended, and many also provided hospitality to travelers and medical care to the surrounding lay population. This charitable imperative created a need for medicines, and that need in turn created the monastic pharmacy. At the heart of monastic medicine was the herbularius, the physic garden. This was no ordinary vegetable patch. It was a carefully designed and meticulously maintained collection of medicinal plants, laid out in geometric patterns that reflected the medieval love of order and symbolism. The gardens were typically divided into square or rectangular beds separated by narrow paths, allowing easy access for harvesting. The plants grown there were called simples in French, a term that passed into English, referring to medicinal herbs used individually rather than in complex compounds. The range of plants cultivated was extensive. There was sage, believed to strengthen the memory and prolong life. There was rosemary, used for headaches and to improve circulation. Mint grew in abundance, prescribed for digestive complaints. Rue, with its bitter leaves, was thought to improve eyesight and ward off plague. Feverfew was given, as its name suggests, to reduce fevers. Wormwood treated intestinal parasites. Fennel aided digestion and freshened breath. Lavender soothed anxiety and promoted sleep. Each plant had its purpose, its specific virtues. Knowledge passed down from the ancient world and expanded through monastic experimentation. Some monasteries became famous for their medical gardens. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, founded in the 8th century, had an elaborate plan that survives to this day, showing a perfectly organized complex that included a detailed medicinal garden layout. The monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy, the very birthplace of Benedictine monasticism, maintained extensive gardens and a renowned medical tradition. In England, the Benedictine monasteries cultivated physic gardens that supplied not only their own infirmaries but also local populations. The monk assigned to the care of the sick and the preparation of medicines was often given special training. He would spend years learning to identify plants, understanding when and how to harvest them for maximum potency. Different parts of plants were used for different purposes. Sometimes it was the root, dug up in autumn when the plant's energy had withdrawn into the earth. Sometimes it was the leaves, picked in spring when they were freshest. Sometimes it was the flowers, gathered at the peak of bloom. Seeds, bark, resin, all had their uses. The timing of harvest was considered crucial, with many monks believing that plants gathered at certain phases of the moon or hours of the day possessed greater power. Once harvested, the plant materials had to be processed and preserved. This was skilled work. Leaves and flowers were laid out to dry in well-ventilated rooms, often the monastery attic. They had to be turned regularly to prevent mold. Once dried, they were stored in ceramic jars or wooden boxes, carefully labeled. Some materials were ground into powder using a mortar and pestle. Others were infused in wine or vinegar to extract their active principles. The monks developed expertise in creating tinctures, decoctions, infusions, and poultices. The monastic pharmacy was a dedicated space, separate from the main infirmary. It had shelves lined with storage vessels, a large table for preparation, scales for weighing ingredients precisely, and the essential tools of the trade. Mortars and pestles in various sizes, knives for cutting and chopping, sieve for straining, and ceramic or glass vessels for mixing and storage. The room often had a fireplace or brazier, necessary for heating certain preparations. Monks had access to books, and this gave them an enormous advantage over lay healers. In their libraries were precious manuscripts, laboriously copied by previous generations, containing the accumulated medical wisdom of antiquity. They could study Dioscorides and learn about plants they might never have encountered. They could read Galen and understand the theory of humors that underlay all medieval medicine. They could consult specialized herbals, manuscripts devoted entirely to plants and their properties, often beautifully illustrated with color drawings. One of the most important texts was the Herbarium Apulei, also known as the Pseudo-Apuleius Herbarium. This was a late antique text that had been translated into various languages, including Old English, and was widely copied in monastic scriptoria. It provided practical information on identifying and using medicinal herbs. The entry for yarrow, for instance, described treatments for toothache, wounds, and urinary problems, and noted that the Greek hero Achilles had used this plant to heal battle injuries. This blending of practical instruction with classical legend was typical of medieval medical texts, lending ancient authority to contemporary practice. The monks did not merely copy existing knowledge. They added their own observations, their own remedies developed through trial and error. They noted which herbs grew best in their local climate and soil. They discovered new combinations that seemed to work better than traditional formulas. Some of these monastic recipes became famous and were produced commercially for centuries. Benedictine liqueur, still made today according to an ancient recipe, was originally created by monks as a medicinal tonic. The range of medicines prepared in monastic pharmacies was extraordinary. There were syrups made from honey and herbs, given for coughs and sore throats. There were rose water and violet water, used as cooling lotions. There were ointments made from animal fat or beeswax mixed with ground herbs, applied to wounds and skin conditions. There were poultices, warm compresses of crushed plant material applied directly to affected areas. There were powders, carefully measured doses of ground substances to be taken mixed with wine or water. Wine itself was a crucial component of monastic medicine. It served as a solvent, extracting the active principles from herbs more effectively than water. It was also an antiseptic, though the monks did not understand this in modern terms. They simply observed that wounds washed with wine healed better than those washed with water. Herbal wines, with various plants steeped in the alcohol for weeks or months, were prescribed for countless ailments. A wine infused with wormwood aided digestion. One made with sage strengthened the elderly. Wine with added spices and herbs was considered especially healthful. The monastic infirmary was often open to the lay poor, and this brought monks into contact with a constant stream of illness and injury. They treated fevers, coughs, digestive complaints, wounds, skin diseases, and countless other maladies. This practical experience, combined with their theoretical learning from books, made the best monastic physicians formidable healers. They were empiricists in the truest sense, testing remedies and observing results. As monasteries grew wealthier and more numerous in the High Middle Ages, some began to specialize in medical care. The monastery at Camaldoli, east of Florence, founded in the 11th century by a Benedictine monk named Romuald, established a hospital for the poor. The monks there developed such skill in preparing medicines that people traveled from distant cities to obtain their remedies. Similarly, the Dominican convent built next to the Basilica of Santa Maria Novella in Florence in 1221 became famous for its pharmacy. When the friars successfully treated a wealthy Florentine merchant, word spread, and soon people from all over the city were coming to the convent for medicines. This monastic pharmacy at Santa Maria Novella was so successful that it continued operation for centuries, eventually becoming a commercial enterprise. It still exists today, making it one of the oldest pharmacies in the world still in use. The success of these monastic pharmacies created a template that would be followed when apothecary shops began opening in secular settings. The emphasis on quality ingredients, careful preparation, accurate dosing, and proper storage all originated in the quiet rooms behind monastery walls where monks ground herbs with devotion, seeing their work as service to God through service to the suffering. Women, too, played a crucial role in this monastic medical tradition, though their contributions have often been overlooked. In convents and nunneries across Europe, women religious cultivated medicinal gardens, prepared remedies, and treated the sick. Some became renowned for their medical knowledge. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess, was a polymath who wrote extensively on medicine and natural history. Her works described hundreds of plants and their medicinal uses, combining traditional knowledge with her own observations and mystical visions. In Renaissance Italy, nuns became prominent sources for medicinal needs, initially using their knowledge within the convent to maintain the health of their sisters, but later expanding their practice to serve the urban population, creating pharmacies that generated income for their charitable works. The monastic model of the pharmacy, with its emphasis on learning, careful preparation, and service to the community, would shape the secular apothecaries that emerged in Europe's growing cities. When urban apothecaries opened their shops on bustling market streets in the 13th and 14th centuries, they inherited not just the recipes and techniques of the monasteries, but also the ethical framework, the understanding that preparing medicines was a sacred trust, a responsibility that carried the weight of human life and death. The rise of urban apothecary shops. By the year 1200, Europe was changing. The continent was emerging from what historians once mistakenly called the Dark Ages. Cities were growing. Trade routes were opening. Merchants grew wealthy. Cathedrals soared toward heaven, their construction projects employing thousands. Universities were being founded, centers of learning where knowledge was no longer confined to monastery walls. And with this urban renaissance came a new figure on the medieval street, the secular apothecary. The transition from monastic to urban pharmacy did not happen all at once. It was a gradual evolution driven by several forces. The growing urban population needed medical care, but not everyone could afford a university-trained physician, and not everyone lived near a monastery with an infirmary open to the public. This created opportunity for enterprising individuals who had learned the art of preparing medicines to open shops and make a living from their skills. The first secular apothecaries emerged from an unlikely source, the spice trade. In cities across Europe, there existed guilds of spice merchants, traders who imported exotic goods from the East. These epiciers in France, speziali in Italy, or pepperers in England dealt in valuable commodities. Black pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, ginger from China. But the line between spice and medicine was blurry in the medieval mind. Many of the same substances used to flavor food were also considered medicinal. Cinnamon and anise freshened breath and aided digestion. Ginger settled the stomach. Pepper was thought to warm the body and dry excess moisture. Because spice merchants already possessed networks for importing rare and valuable substances, they were ideally positioned to expand into the pharmaceutical trade. They could obtain not just culinary spices, but also medicinal materials that did not grow in Europe. Precious aloe from Arabia, exotic woods and resins, rare minerals. They had the commercial infrastructure, the capital, and the knowledge of global trade routes. It was a short step from selling spices to selling medicines, and many took it. This commercial origin gave the early apothecaries a different character from their monastic predecessors. They were businessmen as well as healers. They thought in terms of profit and loss, supply and demand. They competed with one another for customers. They invested in attractive shop fronts and elaborate storage vessels that would impress potential buyers. The apothecary shop became not just a place to obtain medicines, but a commercial establishment designed to inspire confidence and convey legitimacy. The typical apothecary shop of the 13th or 14th century occupied the ground floor of a building on a major commercial street in the city. Location was crucial. Apothecaries wanted to be visible, accessible, and associated with prosperity. They often clustered in certain districts, creating a concentration of medical services that customers could easily find. In some cities, entire streets or quarters became known for their apothecaries. The shop front was carefully designed to attract attention and communicate the proprietor's status. The facade might be painted in bright colors. A sign would hang above the door, often depicting a mortar and pestle, the universal symbol of the pharmaceutical arts, or perhaps an image of a medicinal plant or a saint associated with healing. The sign served a practical purpose in an age when many customers could not read, allowing them to identify the shop visually. Stepping through the doorway, a customer would enter a space designed to inspire confidence. The room was dominated by shelves, floor to ceiling, lined with rows of ceramic jars. These are not simple clay pots. They were maiolica, elaborately decorated earthenware vessels, often imported from Italy or Spain, painted in vibrant blues, greens, and yellows with intricate patterns, and sometimes the coat of arms of the shop's patron or the city itself. Each jar bore a label indicating its contents, written in abbreviated Latin, names of herbs, minerals, compounds. The visual impact of these hundreds of jars was intentional. They represented wealth, knowledge, and preparedness. They told the customer that this apothecary had access to the rarest and most exotic substances, that he was ready to compound any remedy a physician might prescribe. The jars themselves were valuable objects, worth considerable sums, and their display was a form of advertising. At the center of the shop stood the counter, usually made of heavy wood, worn smooth from decades of use. This was the apothecary's workstation. Here he would weigh out ingredients on precision scales, mix compounds in ceramic bowls, grind materials with mortar and pestle. Behind the counter, the apothecary presided like a merchant prince, dressed in fine robes that announced his status. He was not a laborer. He was a learned man, versed in Latin, knowledgeable about medicine and botany, and entrusted with life or death responsibilities. The apothecary shop employed several people. The master apothecary owned and operated the establishment, but he would have apprentices, typically young boys bound to him by contract for 7 years or more. These apprentices did the menial work, sweeping the floor, cleaning vessels, fetching water, and, gradually, as they gained skill and trust, preparing simpler compounds under the master's supervision. There might also be a journeyman, a trained apothecary who had completed his apprenticeship but had not yet achieved master status or accumulated enough capital to open his own shop. The journeyman performed skilled work, freeing the master to focus on the most complex preparations and on dealing with important customers. In the back of the shop, away from public view, was the preparation room or laboratory. This was where the actual work of pharmaceutical chemistry took place. Here were the large mortars and pestles for grinding bulk quantities of material. Here were the implements for distillation, alembics, carefully designed vessels of glass or copper for heating liquids and capturing their vapors, used to create essential oils and alcohol-based tinctures. There were furnaces and braziers for heating. There were tables stained with 1,000 different substances, evidence of years of chemical work. This room often had a peculiar, complex smell, a blend of herbs, minerals, smoke, and alcohol. The inventory of a medieval apothecary shop was astonishing in its diversity. The jars on the shelves contained materials organized into categories that reflected medieval medical theory. There were the vegetable simples, hundreds of different dried herbs, roots, seeds, leaves, flowers, and barks. There were animal-derived substances, ground crab claws, coral, pearls, musk from deer, ambergris from whales, dried earthworms, and countless others. There were mineral substances, various salts, sulfur, quicksilver, gold leaf, powdered precious gems. The range spanned from the mundane to the exotic, from local herbs that cost pennies to imported rarities worth their weight in gold. The apothecary did not just sell pre-made remedies. Much of his work involved compounding medicines to order, following prescriptions written by physicians. A physician would examine a patient, diagnose the ailment according to the theory of humors, and write out a prescription specifying exactly what substances should be combined and in what proportions. The patient would then take this prescription to an apothecary, who would prepare the medicine. This division of labor mirrored the ancient distinction between physician and pharmacist that had existed in Egypt and Greece. However, For customers who could not afford a physician's consultation, the apothecary often acted as a medical advisor as well. People would come in describing their symptoms, and the apothecary would recommend a remedy based on his experience. This practice put apothecaries in a somewhat ambiguous position, as they were encroaching on territory that physicians considered their exclusive domain. It would lead to centuries of conflict and legal battles between the two professions. The prices charged by apothecaries varied enormously depending on the remedy. Simple herbal preparations might cost a few pennies, affordable even for a laborer. But complex compounds requiring rare imported ingredients could cost a small fortune, affordable only by the wealthy. The most expensive medicines of all were the great antidotes, the theriac and mithridate, which we will discuss in detail later. These elaborate concoctions, containing dozens or even hundreds of ingredients, some extraordinarily rare, could cost as much as a farm or a house. Apothecaries sold more than just medicines. Their shops were general stores for a range of products that required skilled preparation. They sold cosmetics, particularly popular with wealthy women, face powders, rouge, perfumes, oils for the hair. They sold candied fruits and preserved ginger, considered both delicacies and digestive aids. They sold incense for religious and domestic use. They sold artists' pigments, ground from minerals and plants, which required the same skills and equipment used in pharmacy. In many cities, apothecaries and artists belonged to the same guild, the Guild of St. Luke, because their crafts overlapped so significantly. The apothecary shop was more than a retail establishment. It was a social space, a place where people gathered not just to purchase medicines but to exchange news and gossip. The apothecary himself was an important figure in his community. He was educated, relatively wealthy, and possessed knowledge that gave him a certain authority. People came to him for advice on matters of health and well-being. He was privy to intimate details of people's lives, to their illnesses and fears. This knowledge could be a source of power and influence, and not all apothecaries used it ethically. By the 13th century, apothecary shops existed in every major European city and in many towns as well. Each city had its own character and specialty. Venice became famous for its theriac, considered the finest and most authentic antidote in all Europe. Florence developed a reputation for high-quality pharmaceutical preparations and beautiful apothecary jars. Paris had the most tightly regulated apothecaries, subject to strict oversight by the Faculty of Medicine. London's apothecaries formed powerful guilds that jockeyed for position and privilege within the complex hierarchy of the city's medical establishment. The physical presence of these shops, with their painted signs, their distinctive smells wafting into the street, their display of jars visible through open doors and windows, changed the face of the medieval city. They represented a new kind of commercial space, one that combined retail, craft production, and learned expertise. The apothecary standing behind his counter, weighing out precious substances with careful precision, was a new urban type, part merchant, part scholar, part craftsman, and always, inevitably, a person who held in his hands the power to heal or to harm. Inside the apothecary, tools, equipment, and layout. To understand the medieval apothecary, we must understand his tools. These were not merely objects. They were extensions of the practitioner's skill and knowledge, precision instruments that made the difference between an effective medicine and a useless powder, between a healing dose and a lethal one. Let us step inside a well-appointed apothecary shop of the 15th century and examine the implements of this ancient craft. The first thing you would notice, besides the overwhelming shelves of ceramic jars, would be the scales. Not a single scale, but several, each designed for different purposes. Precision in measurement was absolutely critical in pharmacy. Too little of an active ingredient rendered a medicine useless. Too much could kill. The apothecary's reputation, and indeed his customers' lives, depended on his ability to weigh accurately. The primary scale was a balance beam, suspended from a central point with pans hanging from either end. The finest examples were made of brass or bronze, carefully calibrated and beautifully decorated. The beam itself, might be engraved with the maker's mark and decorative patterns. The pans were typically shallow dishes of beaten copper or brass, kept scrupulously clean because any contamination could throw off the weight. The apothecary would place the substance to be measured in one pan and standardized weights in the other, adding or removing weight until the beam hung perfectly level. The weights themselves were a crucial part of the apothecary's kit. They came in sets, usually stored in a wooden case with fitted compartments. The medieval system of pharmaceutical weights was based on the grain, supposedly the weight of a single grain of wheat, though the actual standard was a precisely manufactured bronze weight. From the grain, the system built up through scruples, drams, and ounces. An apothecary working from a physician's prescription had to convert these measurements accurately, and the slightest error could have serious consequences. Smaller, more delicate scales were used for weighing precious substances, powdered gems, gold leaf, the most expensive imported spices. These might be made with chains instead of pans, with tiny hooks from which silk threads could be suspended, allowing weighing of minute quantities. The apothecary who could boast of owning such scales advertised his capability to work with the rarest and most valuable materials. Next to the scales, you would find the mortars and pestles, the most iconic tools of the pharmaceutical trade. An apothecary shop would have many of these, in various sizes and materials. The largest might be bronze, weighing 20 pounds or more, used for grinding bulk quantities of hard roots or bark. The interior would be deeply pitted from years of use, showing where countless substances have been reduced to powder by the circular motion of the pestle. Medium-sized mortars, made of marble or soapstone, were used for everyday work. These materials were soft enough to be easily cleaned, but hard enough to grind most substances effectively. The pestle for such a mortar would be carefully matched to the bowl's interior, ground to fit precisely so that materials would not escape being crushed. An experienced apothecary developed a rhythmic technique, a particular motion of the wrist and forearm that allowed him to grind efficiently for hours without tiring. For the finest powders, and for substances that needed to avoid contamination by metal, there were mortars made of porcelain or glass. These were expensive and fragile, but necessary for certain specialized work. The interior of such a mortar would be glazed smooth, allowing no place for residue to hide. After each use, the mortar would be scrupulously cleaned, typically by grinding clean sand in it until all traces of the previous substance were removed. The art of grinding was more complex than it appeared. Different substances required different techniques. A dried leaf might need only gentle crushing. A hard mineral like cinnabar required hours of patient grinding, adding drops of water or wine gradually, until a perfectly uniform powder was achieved. Some substances, like camphor, needed to be ground with small amounts of alcohol or oil to prevent them from sublimating into vapor. An apprentice learned these techniques over years, under the watchful eye of his master. Alongside the grinding tools, you would find a collection of blades, knives of various sizes for cutting and chopping plant materials, specialized scrapers for preparing certain substances, and fine-toothed saws for cutting hardwoods and roots. These blades were kept sharp and clean, and like all tools in the apothecary shop, they were seen as requiring both care and respect. For liquid preparations, the apothecary had an array of vessels and filters. There were funnels of brass or ceramic for transferring liquids without spillage. There were sieves of various grades, from coarse cloth to fine silk, for straining out unwanted material. There were the alembics and stills used for distillation, perhaps the most sophisticated equipment in the shop. A typical alembic consisted of three main parts: a cucurbit, or pot, which held the liquid to be distilled, a alembic head, which fit over the top of the cucurbit and collected the rising vapors, and a spout that directed the condensed vapor into a receiving vessel. The cucurbit was usually made of copper or ceramic and designed to sit over a flame or in a sand bath for gentle, even heating. The head might be made of copper or, in more expensive models, glass, which allowed the apothecary to observe the distillation process. Distillation was used to create various products. Essential oils were extracted from aromatic plants: oil of roses, oil of lavender, oil of mint. These were used in perfumes and as medicinal substances in their own right. Distillation could also concentrate alcohol, creating aqua vitae, the water of life, a powerful spirit used both as a solvent for other medicines and as a medicine itself, thought to strengthen the heart and resist plague. The process required skill and patience, sometimes running for hours or even days, with the apothecary monitoring the flame and the flow of distillate, adjusting as needed. For mixing compounds, the apothecary had various bowls and dishes, typically ceramic, but sometimes metal for substances that needed heating. There were spatulas for spreading ointments and compounds. There were ladles and long-handled spoons for working with hot liquids. There were specialized tools like pill-making devices, flat surfaces with parallel grooves where the apothecary would roll soft paste into long cylinders that would then be cut into individual pills. Storage was an art in itself. The great ceramic jars that lined the walls were the most visible form of storage, but they were not the only one. Some substances needed to be kept from light, so they were stored in opaque vessels or wrapped in cloth. Some needed protection from moisture and were kept in sealed jars with wax or parchment over the mouth. Some needed air circulation and were stored in loosely covered baskets. The apothecary had to know not just what he had, but also how to keep it fresh and potent. The jars themselves deserve closer examination, for they were among the most beautiful objects in the medieval apothecary shop. Made of maiolica, a tin-glazed earthenware, they were decorated by skilled artists with intricate designs. The typical jar was wide-mouthed, with a slightly bulging body and a narrow base. The decoration might include geometric patterns, floral motifs, or scenes from classical mythology or Christian tradition. The most elaborate jars were commissioned pieces, bearing the coat of arms of the shop's noble patron or the symbol of the city's medical guild. The labels on these jars were abbreviated Latin, often cryptic to the uninitiated. Rad rhubarb indicated powdered rhubarb root. Semcorian was coriander seeds. Theriac, Venet, meant Venus theriac, the famous antidote. An experienced apothecary could read these abbreviations at a glance, but for the apprentice, learning the Latin names and abbreviations was one of the fundamental skills that had to be mastered. Lighting the shop required careful thought. Open flames were dangerous in a space filled with flammable substances and delicate equipment, but work often continued after dark. Candles were used sparingly, placed in secure holders away from volatile materials. Some shops had oil lamps, which provided steadier light. Later in the medieval period, glass lenses filled with water were used to concentrate and amplify candlelight, creating a brighter working area without additional fire risk. The air in an apothecary shop had a distinctive smell, complex and layered. There was the earthy scent of dried herbs, the sharpness of vinegar and alcohol, the sweetness of honey and syrups, the acrid bite of sulfur and minerals, and underlying it all, a mustiness from the wooden furniture and the age of the building itself. Customers entering from the street would be immediately struck by this aroma, so different from the cooking smells and animal odors that dominated most medieval urban spaces. It was an olfactory announcement that this was a place of learning and craft, not of ordinary commerce. The layout of the shop reflected a carefully considered workflow. The most frequently used materials were kept close at hand, on lower shelves near the counter. Less common substances were stored higher up or toward the back. Expensive rarities might be kept in a locked cabinet or even in a separate secured room. The preparation area was separate from the public space, allowing the apothecary to work without distraction or interference. Some shops had a small garden or courtyard behind the building where the apothecary could grow his own medicinal herbs. This was especially common in smaller towns where rents were cheaper and space more available. Having a personal garden gave the apothecary better control over quality and ensured a supply of fresh materials at the proper harvest time. The garden might also serve as a teaching space where apprentices learned to identify plants in their growing state, not just as dried material in jars. The investment required to set up a well-equipped apothecary shop was substantial. The building rent or purchase price, the ceramic jars, the bronze mortars and scales, the initial stock of raw materials from dozens of suppliers across Europe and beyond, all added up to a considerable sum. This high cost of entry helped maintain the exclusivity of the profession and made it difficult for poorly trained or unscrupulous individuals to establish themselves. Only those with proper training and financial backing could hope to succeed. Every object in the apothecary shop, from the smallest weight to the largest storage jar, represented years of accumulated knowledge about pharmaceutical practice. The tools have been refined over centuries to meet the specific demands of the craft. In the hands of a skilled apothecary, they transformed raw nature into healing medicine, and occasionally, as we shall see, in a silent death. The path to mastery, training, and apprenticeship. The journey to becoming a master apothecary was long, difficult, and expensive. It was not a path that could be walked by just anyone. The boy who entered an apothecary shop at age 12 or 13 to begin his apprenticeship was embarking on a commitment that would consume the next 7 years of his life or more. He would live in his master's household, work long hours for no pay beyond room and board, and slowly, gradually, learn the countless skills and secrets that separated a true apothecary from a mere charlatan. The apprenticeship began with a contract, a legal document that bound the boy to his master. This indenture, as it was called, specified the terms of the arrangement in precise legal language. The master agreed to teach the apprentice the art and mystery of the apothecary's trade, to provide food, lodging, and sometimes clothing, and to not abuse or overwork the boy. The apprentice, or more accurately his father or guardian, agreed to pay a fee to the master, typically a substantial sum representing compensation for the training to be provided. The apprentice agreed to serve faithfully, to keep his master's secrets, to not waste his master's materials, and to conduct himself with proper moral behavior. In some cities, like London after the formation of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in 1617, these indentures were registered with the guild and became official documents. Breaking an apprenticeship contract could result in legal penalties for both parties. The system was designed to protect both master and apprentice, ensuring that the apprentice received legitimate training and that the master's investment of time was not wasted by a boy who simply ran away after a few months. The first years of apprenticeship were primarily devoted to menial labor. The new apprentice would sweep the shop, clean the mortars and pestles, wash the storage jars, fetch water from the well, and run errands. This was not wasted time, though it might have seemed so to an impatient boy. While performing these simple tasks, the apprentice was absorbing the atmosphere of the shop, learning the rhythm of the work, observing the master at his craft. He was learning indirectly, through immersion, the same way a child learns language. As he demonstrated trustworthiness and developed basic competence, the apprentice would be given slightly more complex tasks. He might be allowed to grind simple substances that did not require great skill, repetitive work that freed the master for more demanding preparations. He would learn to maintain the tools, keeping blades sharp and surfaces clean. He would learn the proper way to label and store materials. All of this was foundational knowledge, unglamorous but essential. A crucial part of the early training was learning Latin. This was not optional. The entire medical and pharmaceutical world operated in Latin. Physicians wrote prescriptions in Latin. The standard pharmacopoeias, the official books listing medicines and their formulations, were in Latin. The labels on the storage jars were in Latin. An apothecary who could not read Latin could not read a prescription, could not consult the authoritative texts, and could not function in the profession. Masters typically required apprentices to attend lessons with a local priest or tutor, where they taught Latin themselves, spending hours in the evening after the shop closed drilling the apprentice on vocabulary and grammar. Alongside Latin came the study of materia medica, the catalog of medicinal substances. The apprentice had to memorize hundreds of items, herbs, minerals, animal products. He had to learn their Latin names, their common names in the local language, their properties according to medical theory, their uses, their dosages, and their potential dangers. This was a massive body of knowledge, and it could only be acquired through patient study and repetition. Herborizing expeditions were an important part of this botanical education. The master would take apprentices on walks in fields, forests, and along riverbanks, teaching them to identify medicinal plants in their natural habitat. They would learn to distinguish between similar species, some of which might be helpful while others were deadly. They would learn to recognize plants at different stages of growth, understanding when each was ready to be harvested for maximum potency. They would learn which parts of each plant to use: root, leaf, flower, seed, bark. In England, the Society of Apothecaries organized official herborizing expeditions, outings where masters and apprentices would walk through the countryside around London, a tutor pointing out and explaining plants. These became social occasions as well as educational ones, with the group often stopping at an inn for refreshment. But they served a serious purpose, ensuring that the next generation of apothecaries could accurately identify the raw materials of their craft. As the apprentice advanced in his training, usually around the third or fourth year, he would begin to participate in actual pharmaceutical preparation. Initially, this meant assisting the master in straightforward tasks: holding vessels, stirring mixtures, maintaining the fire under a distillation apparatus. But gradually, under close supervision, he would be allowed to prepare simple medicines himself. He would learn the techniques of grinding, of mixing, of heating, of distilling. He would learn to judge when a powder was fine enough, when a mixture was properly blended, when a syrup had reached the right consistency. Precision was emphasized constantly. The master would drill into the apprentice that accuracy in measurement was not just important, but sacred. A mistake could kill someone. This responsibility weighed heavily, and it was intentional. The profession needed men who understood that they were not just making products to sell, but were holding human lives in their hands. The training included instruction in the theory of medicine, particularly the concept of humoral theory that dominated medieval medical thought. The apprentice had to understand that health was seen as a balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each person had a unique humoral constitution, and illness resulted from imbalance. Medicines were classified according to their effects on these humors. Some were heating, others cooling. Some were drying, others moistening. The proper remedy for any ailment required understanding which humor was in excess or deficiency, and prescribing a medicine with the opposite quality to restore balance. Apprentices learned practical skills beyond pharmaceutical preparation. They learned bookkeeping, for every shop maintained records of purchases and sales. They learned to negotiate with suppliers, evaluating the quality of raw materials offered for sale. They learned to interact with customers, to be respectful to wealthy clients, to be patient with the poor, and to recognize when someone was trying to deceive or cheat them. They learned the shop's secrets, particular recipes or techniques that the master had developed, and that gave him a competitive advantage. These were guarded jealously and shared only with trusted apprentices who had proven their loyalty and discretion. Women, though excluded from formal apprenticeship in most places and times, sometimes obtained pharmaceutical training through indirect routes. The wives and daughters of apothecaries often worked in the family shop, and their years of experience were considered by some guilds to constitute an informal apprenticeship. In 17th century England, widows of apothecaries were sometimes allowed to continue operating their husbands' businesses, and the guild recognized their competence gained through years of practical experience. A few women managed to become acknowledged as skilled apothecaries despite the formal barriers. The apprenticeship culminated in a test, an examination administered by the guild, or, in some places, by a group of senior apothecaries appointed for this purpose. The specifics varied by location and era, but generally, the test included both a written and practical component. The apprentice would be asked to identify substances from their appearance, smell, or taste. He would be given prescriptions to compound, expected to work quickly and accurately. He would be questioned orally on pharmaceutical theory, on the properties of medicines, on proper dosages. Guild records from around 1620 indicate that apprentices found incompetent were dismissed until he can give better proof of his sufficiency to exercise the art of an apothecary. Passing this examination allowed the apprentice to become a journeyman, a certified practitioner of the craft who could work for wages in someone else's shop. But it did not grant him the right to open his own establishment. For that, he needed to achieve master status, which required additional years of work, accumulation of capital, and often a separate examination or proof of competence. In some cities, becoming a master also required producing a masterpiece, a particularly complex preparation that demonstrated the highest level of skill. The social structure of the apprenticeship system created strong bonds between master and apprentice. The apprentice lived in the master's household as a member of the family, eating at the same table, sleeping under the same roof. This intimate proximity meant that the master's influence extended far beyond professional training. The master was a father figure, a mentor in all aspects of life. He oversaw the apprentice's moral development, his conduct with women, his religious observance, his spending habits. The relationship, when it worked well, was one of mutual respect and affection. Many apprentices remained connected to their masters for their entire lives, and some married the master's daughter, continuing the family business. The system, however, was not without its abuses. Some masters exploited apprentices as cheap labor, teaching them little while working them hard. Some beat apprentices or subjected them to degrading treatment. The legal protections for apprentices were real, but not always enforced. An apprentice who fled from an abusive master could find himself unable to complete his training elsewhere, his years of service wasted. The power dynamic was fundamentally unequal, and not all masters exercised their power responsibly. Despite these problems, the apprenticeship system generally succeeded in its purpose, creating a class of skilled, knowledgeable practitioners who could prepare medicines safely and effectively. The apothecary who hung out his sign as a master was announcing to his community that he had spent years acquiring expertise, that he had been tested and found competent, and that he could be trusted. This trust was the foundation of his business and the source of his authority in medical matters. The pharmacopoeia, a world of ingredients. The shelves of a medieval apothecary shop contain a microcosm of the known world. Every jar, every box, every bundle of dried herbs represented a connection to a specific place, a particular cultivation, sometimes an arduous journey across continents. The diversity of materials available to a well-stocked apothecary was staggering, ranging from common plants that grew wild in local fields to rare substances imported from the far reaches of the earth at enormous expense. To understand what the medieval apothecary sold, we must understand his inventory. The foundation of medieval pharmacy was herbal, plants, or more precisely, specific parts of plants, carefully harvested and preserved. The humble garden herbs came first. Sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, fennel, these grew in almost every monastery garden and many household plots. They were inexpensive, available, familiar. Sage was considered strengthening and was thought to improve memory in the elderly. Rosemary aided circulation and treated headaches. Thyme helped with chest ailments and coughs. Mint settled the stomach. Fennel was given to nursing mothers to increase milk production. Then came the more specialized medicinal herbs, plants grown specifically for pharmaceutical use. Wormwood, intensely bitter, was the primary treatment for intestinal worms, a common affliction in an age of poor sanitation. Rue, with its pungent, acrid smell, was used for eye problems and to bring on delayed menstruation. Feverfew, as its name suggests, reduced fevers. Valerian root, dug up in autumn, was a powerful sedative, used for insomnia and nervous conditions. St. John's wort, with its bright yellow flowers, treated melancholy and wounds. Each herb had its proper applications, its specific virtues recognized through centuries of use. Some plants were so valuable that they became commercial crops, cultivated on a large scale for sale to apothecaries. Saffron, the dried stigmas of a particular crocus, was among the most expensive substances in the apothecary shop. It took thousands of flowers to produce a single ounce, and each stigma had to be handpicked. Saffron was used as a medicine for countless ailments, from digestive problems to melancholy, and its high price meant it was primarily available to the wealthy. It was also used as a dye, coloring fabrics and illuminated manuscripts a brilliant yellow-orange. Opium was another major commercial crop, cultivated in several regions, but with the finest quality coming from Thebes in Egypt and later from parts of the Middle East. The unripe seed pods of the opium poppy were carefully scored with a knife, and the milky latex that oozed out was collected and dried. This raw opium was the medieval world's most powerful painkiller and sedative. It was prescribed for severe pain, for uncontrollable coughing, for diarrhea, and for insomnia. It was also dangerously addictive, though medieval physicians did not fully understand this. Apothecaries handled opium with care, measuring it precisely, aware of its potency. Rhubarb root, imported from China and Tibet, was one of the most prized purgatives, used to cleanse the digestive system. The genuine article was rare and expensive, and its importation was controlled by Venetian merchants who guarded their sources jealously. Aloe, a resin from East Africa and Arabia, was another important purgative. Myrrh and frankincense, the famous gifts of the Magi, were not just incense, but medicinal resins used in various preparations. The list of plant materials goes on almost endlessly. There was licorice root from Cappadocia, chewed to soothe sore throats and used in cough syrups. There was cinnamon bark from Ceylon, considered both a spice and a medicine, used to warm the body and aid digestion. There was camphor from China and Southeast Asia, a waxy substance with a powerful odor, used in liniments and as a stimulant. There was belladonna, deadly nightshade, whose berries could kill, but whose carefully measured extracts were used to dilate the pupils of the eye and as a powerful sedative. Animal-derived ingredients formed another major category. These were often bizarre by modern standards, but made perfect sense within medieval medical theory. Ground pearls were prescribed for heart problems and to strengthen the body generally. Coral, powdered or burned, was used similarly. Both were thought to absorb poisons from the body. Ivory shavings served much the same purpose. Musk, the secretion from glands of male musk deer, imported from Tibet, was an extraordinarily expensive perfume ingredient, but also a medicine, used to treat heart palpitations and as a stimulant. Ambergris, a waxy substance found floating in the ocean or washed up on beaches, produced in the intestines of sperm whales, was another precious material. It was used primarily in perfumery, but also appeared in expensive medical preparations, thought to strengthen the heart and brain. Its rarity made it more valuable than gold, weight for weight. Various organs and body parts from animals were used. Deer horn, carefully aged and powdered, appeared in numerous recipes. The so-called bones of stag's heart, actually cartilage from the heart area, were ground up for use in precious antidotes. Viper flesh, from poisonous snakes, was a key ingredient in theriac, the great universal antidote. The theory was that the viper, being venomous, contained its own antidote in its flesh. This was the medieval concept of similia, similibus curantur, like cures like, an idea that would resurface centuries later in homeopathy. Less glamorous, but more commonly used were simple animal products. Rendered animal fat, lard or tallow, served as the base for ointments and salves. Beeswax, produced by apothecaries' own beehives or purchased from beekeepers, was mixed with oils and herbal extracts to create medicinal creams. Honey was used not just as a sweetener, but as a preservative and as the base for syrups and electuaries, medicines made into a paste. Dried earthworms, collected after rain and carefully dried, were ground into powder and prescribed for all manner of ailments, particularly those affecting the joints. Mineral substances made up the third major category of the apothecary's inventory. These were often the most dangerous materials in the shop. Sulfur, bright yellow and acrid smelling, was used externally for skin diseases and internally, in tiny doses, as a purgative. Mercury, quicksilver, that strange liquid metal, was used to treat syphilis and various skin conditions, though it often caused as much harm as good. Gold, either as gold leaf or dissolved in aqua regia to create aurum potable, drinkable gold, was prescribed for heart problems and to strengthen the elderly, based on the theory that the noblest metal must have the noblest medicinal properties. Various salts were essential. Common salt was used as a preservative and in certain medicines. Niter, potassium nitrate, was a component of many preparations. Sal ammoniac, ammonium chloride, was used in cough remedies and as a smelling salt to revive those who had fainted. Alum, a complex aluminum salt, was an astringent used to stop bleeding and treat mouth and throat infections. Precious gems, ground into powder, appeared in the most expensive medicines. Sapphires, emeralds, rubies, diamonds, all were believed to possess specific medicinal virtues. An emerald was thought to protect against poison and strengthen the eyesight. A ruby strengthened the heart. A diamond fortified the entire body and protected against plague. The amounts used were tiny, partly because of expense, but also because too much of such powerful substances was considered dangerous. The inclusion of powdered gems in a medicine was as much about signaling the medicine's value and potency as about any actual therapeutic effect. The organization of this vast inventory required a systematic approach. The materials were typically arranged according to source: vegetable, animal, mineral. Within each category, they might be further subdivided. Vegetable materials might be grouped as roots, barks, leaves, flowers, seeds, and resins. Each substance had its designated jar or container, and maintaining proper labels and preventing any mix-ups was a constant concern. An error in identification could be fatal. Quality control was challenging in an era before chemical analysis. The apothecary had to rely on his senses and experience to judge the genuineness and quality of materials offered for sale by suppliers. Color, smell, taste, texture, all provided clues. But there was always the risk of adulteration or substitution. Unscrupulous suppliers might mix genuine saffron with cheaper dyed material. They might sell ordinary stones as precious gems. They might pass off the horns of various animals as the legendary unicorn horn. The apothecary had to be part detective, constantly vigilant against fraud. The sourcing of these materials created complex supply chains stretching across the known world. Venetian merchants brought spices and drugs from Alexandria, where Arab traders had transported them from India, Southeast Asia, and China. Genoan merchants had their own routes through the Black Sea region. Northern European traders brought furs and Baltic amber. Spanish merchants controlled much of the trade with North Africa. The apothecary in a medium-sized German or French town relied on this vast commercial network, never seeing the distant places where his materials originated, but utterly dependent on their continued flow. Seasonal variation affected availability. Some herbs could only be harvested in spring, others in autumn. The apothecary had to purchase large quantities when available and store them carefully to last until the next harvest season. Some materials, like roses for rose water or violets for syrup, were only available for a few weeks each year. Missing the harvest meant doing without for another year or purchasing at inflated prices from someone who had laden stock. The sheer diversity of materials meant that no single apothecary could stock everything. Smaller shops focused on the most commonly prescribed items and a selection of more exotic materials to demonstrate their capabilities. Larger, wealthier shops in major cities prided themselves on having even the rarest substances, advertising that they could fill any prescription, no matter how unusual. This global pharmacopoeia, assembled on the shelves of the medieval apothecary shop, represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about the healing properties of natural substances. Much of it was folk wisdom, passed down through generations. Some was based on ancient medical texts. Some was pure superstition and magical thinking. But mixed in with the nonsense were genuinely effective remedies. Willow bark, which contains the precursor to aspirin. Digitalis from foxglove for heart conditions. cinchona bark, which contains quinine for malaria, opium for pain. The medieval apothecaries' inventory was a strange mix of the useful and the useless, the scientific and the magical, but it represented humanity's best attempt, given the knowledge of the time, to harness nature's power to heal. The great medicines, theriac and mithridate. Among all the medicines prepared and sold by medieval apothecaries, none were more famous, more expensive, more wrapped in legend, or more controversial than the two great universal antidotes, mithridate and theriac. These were not simple remedies. They were monumentally complex pharmaceutical preparations containing dozens or even hundreds of ingredients, some common and some extraordinarily rare. They were medicines fit for kings, literally, for kings and popes were among their most enthusiastic consumers. And their story reveals much about medieval medicine's intersection of science, commerce, and belief. The legend of Mithridate begins with a king who lived more than a century before Christ. Mithridates, 6 Eupator, king of Pontus and Armenia Minor, ruled a kingdom on the southern shore of the Black Sea. He was a formidable enemy of Rome, fighting 3 major wars against the expanding republic. But he was also a man consumed by paranoia. His father had been assassinated by poison, possibly at the orders of his own mother. Mithridates himself was in constant danger from court intrigue, rival claimants to his throne, and assassination attempts. Determined not to meet his father's fate, Mithridates embarked on a strange and dangerous course. He became his own experimental subject in the study of poisons and their antidotes. According to ancient accounts, he regularly consumed small amounts of various poisons, attempting to build up immunity. He tested different substances on condemned prisoners, observing their effects and searching for antidotes. Over years of experimentation, he supposedly developed a formula, a mixture of numerous ingredients that, when taken regularly, would protect against any poison. This legendary antidote, Mithridatium or mithridate, contained around 40 to 50 ingredients in its original form. The recipe included opium, myrrh, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, castor, and many others, all mixed together and typically taken with wine. When Pompey the Great finally defeated Mithridates in 63 BCE, he captured the king's medical notes and brought them back to Rome. Roman physicians began preparing versions of the formula, and it quickly became fashionable among the wealthy and powerful who feared assassination. The ironic postscript to Mithridates' story is that his antidote apparently worked too well. When his son rebelled and captured him, the old king tried to commit suicide by poison, but found that he could not. The poisons he took had no effect, his body so thoroughly accustomed to them that fatal doses were merely uncomfortable. Unable to poison himself, he allegedly had to ask a soldier to kill him with a sword. The Roman physician Andromachus, serving the Emperor Nero in the 1st century CE, decided to improve upon Mithridate. He increased the number of ingredients to 64 and made one crucial addition: the flesh of vipers. Poisonous snakes, he reasoned, contain the most potent venom, so their flesh must contain the most potent anti-venom. The vipers had to be prepared in a specific way, their heads and tails cut off, their skin stripped away, and their flesh roasted and then aged for a period before being ground into the mixture. This enhanced version became known as theriac, from the Greek word for wild beast. It was Galen, the great physician of the 2nd century, who really promoted theriac and standardized its preparation. He wrote extensively about it, provided a detailed recipe, and claimed that it reached its greatest potency after aging for 6 years and retained its virtues for 40 years. This aging requirement made theriac production a long-term investment, with batches stored for years before sale. Galen's promotion ensured that theriac became the universal antidote of the ancient and medieval worlds. It was prescribed for an astonishing range of ailments. It was, first and foremost, protection against poison, but it was also given for plague, for epidemic diseases, for fevers, for coughs, for digestive complaints, for practically anything. It was seen as a panacea, a cure-all. The theory was that something so complex containing so many different ingredients, each with its own medicinal virtues, could address any imbalance in the body's humors. By the Middle Ages, the production of theriac had become concentrated in certain cities, with Venice being the most famous. Theriac Venetian, Venice treacle as it was known in England, was considered the gold standard. The Venetian production was tightly controlled by the city authorities. Only certain apothecaries were licensed to make it, and they had to prepare it according to a strict formula that was a closely guarded state secret, though various versions of recipes circulated. The production of theriac became a public spectacle. In Venice and other Italian cities, the making of theriac was an elaborate ceremony attended by city officials, physicians, and nobility. All the ingredients were put on public display to verify their quality and authenticity. This transparency was necessary because theriac was so expensive and so important that counterfeiting was a constant concern. The public preparation served as quality assurance, demonstrating that this batch of theriac was the genuine article, made from proper ingredients by licensed apothecaries under official supervision. The ingredient list for Venice treacle was staggering. The recipe included viper flesh, opium, cinnamon, cassia, agaricon, gum arabic, honey, and wine, along with 60 other ingredients. There were roots, iris, birthwort, rhubarb, ginger, gentian, spikenard, valerian. There were stems and barks, cinnamon in quantity, cassia for bulk. There were leaves, water germander, ash leaves, calamint, horehound, lemongrass. There were flowers, fruit, seeds. There were imported resins, myrrh, frankincense, gum arabic, opoponax. There were spices, long pepper, black pepper, cardamom, anise. There were expensive rarities, amomum, skunanth, Celtic spikenard. And there was always opium, the crucial ingredient that gave theriac much of its actual effectiveness as an analgesic and sedative. The preparation process was lengthy and laborious. Generally speaking, all the dry ingredients were powdered separately, beginning with the hardest substances and gradually adding softer ones, to prevent damage to the equipment. The viper flesh was prepared through a complex series of steps. The snakes were decapitated and skinned, the flesh was boiled, then roasted, then dried, then aged, then finally ground into powder. Once all ingredients were powdered, they were mixed according to precise proportions. This mixture was then combined with honey and wine to create a thick paste, an electuary. This paste was packed into special vessels and aged for years. The cost was astronomical. A single dose of high-quality theriac, about 4 grams, cost as much as a chicken or half a goose. A larger therapeutic amount for treating serious illness might cost a week's wages for a skilled worker. Only the wealthy could afford it regularly, though cheaper versions, made with fewer or substitute ingredients, were available for those of more modest means. Theriac of the poor was a simplified formula containing only 5 inexpensive ingredients and omitting the viper flesh and the rarest imports. It was marketed to commoners who wanted the protection of theriac, but could not afford the genuine article. Whether it had any real medical effect is doubtful, but it provided psychological comfort, and perhaps that was enough. The Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, published in 1618, included recipes for theriac, attempting to standardize production in England. But the English versions, like those from other countries, were viewed as inferior to the Venetian. Patients who could afford it insisted on Venice treacle, trusting the Italian apothecary's expertise and the reputation built over centuries. The medical establishment eventually became skeptical of theriac. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder had been skeptical from the beginning, mockingly asking how any human brain could have determined such absurd proportions of ingredients, calling it a showy parade of pharmaceutical art rather than genuine medicine. By the 18th century, more physicians were joining this skeptical camp. William Heberden published his Anatheriaca in 1745, demanding that theriac's alleged properties be tested rigorously rather than accepted on ancient authority. He pointed out that a medicine developed in antiquity could not possibly be effective against modern poisons that the ancients never encountered. Research conducted centuries later, when scientists finally recreated theriac from historical recipes, confirmed the skepticism. The medicine, when analyzed, showed that the amounts of active ingredients in a therapeutic dose were far too small to have significant pharmacological effects. The substances that might actually do something, like opium, were present only in quantities too tiny to matter. The probable effectiveness of theriac was primarily psychological, a placebo effect powered by its immense reputation and high price. But in the medieval period, that reputation was unassailable. Theriac and mithridate represented the pinnacle of pharmaceutical art, the most complex and sophisticated medicines that human ingenuity could produce. They were status symbols, proof of wealth and access to the best medical care. Kings and popes kept supplies of theriac in their private chambers, taking small doses daily as a preventative against poison and disease. Merchants who could afford it carried theriac on long journeys as protection against unfamiliar diseases and contaminated food. Physicians prescribed it for plague, for epilepsy, for melancholy, for practically everything. The apothecary who could advertise that he sold genuine theriac, preferably Venetian, but at minimum made according to a proper recipe, significantly enhanced his reputation and his business. Having theriac in stock signaled that this was a serious, well-connected apothecary capable of obtaining the rarest materials and of executing the most challenging pharmaceutical preparation. The great ceramic jars labeled theriac, Venet. On the apothecary's shelves were advertisements in themselves, visible proof of expertise and quality. The story of theriac and mithridate reveals the medieval mindset toward medicine. There was a faith in complexity, a belief that more ingredients must be better, that a medicine containing substances from across the known world must be more powerful than a simple herbal tea. There was an acceptance of authority, with ancient writers like Galen trusted implicitly, their claims rarely questioned. There was a conflation of value and efficacy, an assumption that an expensive medicine must work better than a cheap one. And there was, underlying it all, a desperation, a fear of sudden death from poison or plague, a hope that somewhere, in some complex formula, lay the key to safety and long life. That these hopes were largely unfounded, that theriac was essentially an expensive placebo, does not diminish its historical importance. For more than 1,500 years, from ancient Rome through the medieval period and into the early modern era, theriac was the most prestigious medicine in the world, the ultimate product of the apothecary's art. Its story is inseparable from the history of pharmacy itself. Poisons, antidotes, and the fear of death. In the shadowed corridors of medieval power, poison was the weapon of choice for those who preferred subtlety to the sword. It was silent. It was subtle. It could strike down the mighty while they sat at table, trusting in their guards and their walls, never suspecting that death had already entered their wine cup. The fear of poisoning haunted every medieval court, every noble household, every gathering of the powerful. And this fear created a market, a desperate demand for protection, for detection, for antidotes. The apothecary, who knew more about poisons than anyone except perhaps a professional poisoner, became a central figure in this deadly game. Medieval poisoning was not the invention of paranoid imaginations. It was real, documented, and relatively common among the elite. Roman citizens of every class had used poison to eliminate enemies and rivals. But the practice reached new heights during the medieval period. In Renaissance Italy, poisoning became almost an art form, with certain families gaining dark reputations for their skill with toxins. The Borgias, that infamous papal family, were credited, perhaps unfairly, with countless poisonings. Whether or not they deserved their reputation, the mere accusation reveals how prevalent the fear was. The favored poisons of the era were primarily plant-based, readily available to anyone with botanical knowledge. Aconite, known as monkshood or wolfsbane, was among the deadliest. The plant grew wild in mountains across Europe, and every part of it was toxic. A tincture of aconite could kill quickly, causing rapid heartbeat, numbness, vomiting, and respiratory paralysis. It was called the Queen of Poisons. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, with its shiny black berries, was another popular choice. The alkaloids it contained, atropine and scopolamine, caused delirium, hallucinations, and eventually coma and death. Hemlock, the same poison that killed Socrates, grew commonly in damp areas. Its alkaloid coniine caused progressive paralysis, shutting down the nervous system while the victim remained conscious, a particularly terrifying death. Arsenic, a mineral poison, was perhaps the most famous of all. It was tasteless, odorless, and nearly undetectable when mixed in food or drink. It caused symptoms that could be mistaken for natural illness: vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. Death could occur within hours of a large dose or be drawn out over days or weeks with smaller repeated amounts. Arsenic was called the inheritance powder for its common use in eliminating inconvenient relatives who stood between someone and a fortune. Given this pervasive threat, the wealthy invested heavily in protective measures. One of the first lines of defense was the taster, a servant whose job was to sample every dish before it reached the master's plate. The taster was essentially a human poison detector, sacrificial insurance against assassination. If the food was poisoned, the taster would sicken or die, providing warning. It was a grim profession, and recruitment could not have been easy. Beyond human tasters, the wealthy turned to supposed poison detectors, objects believed to have the power to reveal toxins. The most famous was the unicorn horn. These horns, supposedly from the mythical one-horned horse, but actually narwhal tusks, were believed to detect poison by sweating or changing color in its presence. They were extraordinarily expensive, worth more than many estates. Royalty kept unicorn horns in their treasuries, sometimes whole, but more often cut into drinking cups. The theory was that poison poured into such a cup would cause the horn to reveal its presence through some visible reaction. In reality, narwhal ivory has no such properties, but the belief was so strong that the placebo effect alone might have provided comfort. More practically, the scarcity and expense of unicorn horns ensured that they were owned only by the very wealthy, and such people had food tasters and many other protections. If no poisoning occurred, the horn got the credit. Bezoar stones were another prized antidote. These concretions, formed in the digestive tracts of ruminant animals like goats and sheep, were believed to neutralize any poison. The name comes from the Persian word padzar, meaning to expel poison. Bezoars were worn as amulets, set into jeweled rings or necklaces. They were also grated into powder and dissolved in liquid to be drunk as an antidote when poisoning was suspected. Interestingly, there is some scientific basis for bezoar's effectiveness against certain poisons. The stones contain brushite, a phosphate compound, and degraded hair rich in sulfur. These combined with arsenic, potentially reducing its toxicity. Medieval users could not have known the chemical mechanism, but they observed that sometimes bezoars seemed to work, and that observation was enough to maintain the belief. However, dramatic failures also occurred. The French surgeon Ambroise Paré, in the 16th century, conducted a grim experiment. A thief sentenced to death was offered a choice: hanging or serving as a test subject for a bezoar's effectiveness. The man chose the bezoar. He was given poison, then administered a bezoar. 6 hours later, he died in agony. The bezoar had been useless. This failure should have discredited bezoars, but belief in them persisted for centuries more. Toadstones were another supposed antidote. These were not actually stones but fossil shark teeth, or calcified objects from toad stomachs. They were believed to work similarly to bezoars, detecting and neutralizing poison. An inventory of Mary Queen of Scots' possessions included a silver bottle containing a stone medicinable against poison. This was likely a toadstone. Precious gems were also employed as antidotes. Emeralds were particularly prized. Medieval texts claimed that emeralds could cure anyone dying from poison. Buse asserted that if 80 barleycorns' weight of powdered emerald were given to a poisoned person, it would save their life. Arabs prized emeralds for this purpose. The physician Ibn Zor supposedly once took a poisonous herb accidentally, then placed an emerald in his mouth and another on his stomach, and was completely cured. The logic behind gem antidotes was part magical, part based on the theory of signatures. The purity and perfection of precious stones were thought to oppose the corruption and impurity of poison. Additionally, gems were rare and expensive, and medieval thought often equated monetary value with medicinal potency. The testing of food and drink reached elaborate levels in some courts. Before serving, dishes would be touched to a unicorn horn or a bezoar to check for poison. Salt cellars might contain special salt mixed with powdered bezoar or gems, which was supposed to neutralize any toxins added to the food. Some nobles employed a credenza, a sideboard where food was formally tested before being brought to the table. The testing performed with great ceremony to reassure the diners. The ultimate protection, however, was preventative medicine. This is where theriac and mithridate, those great antidotes discussed in the previous section, came into play. By taking a daily dose of these complex medicines, one supposedly built up resistance to all poisons. This was the approach Mithridates himself had taken, and medieval royalty followed his example. The logic was that the various ingredients in theriac, which included some mildly toxic substances in tiny amounts, would accustom the body to poisons. The opium content provided a more immediate benefit. It was calming. It reduced anxiety. For a person living in constant fear of assassination, the psychological relief alone made theriac valuable. Whether it actually protected against poison is doubtful, but it protected against the fear of poison, which was perhaps more important. Of course, apothecaries did not only sell antidotes. They also sold poisons, though not openly. The law in most jurisdictions forbade the sale of known poisons, except to licensed physicians for legitimate medical use. The Paris Guild Statutes of 1353 specifically outlawed selling poisonous or dangerous medicines. But laws and practice often diverged. An apothecary familiar with the properties of plants knew very well which ones were lethal. He knew the dosage that would kill. He knew how to disguise a poison in a medicine or flavored syrup. If he were unscrupulous or persuaded by sufficient payment, he might provide a wealthy client with something deadly, carefully packaged and labeled as something innocuous. The apothecary accused of providing poison faced severe punishment. If convicted, he could be executed, often by burning, a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes. The betrayal of his professional duty, using his knowledge to kill rather than heal, was seen as particularly monstrous. Yet the temptation must have been strong. The fees paid for a reliable, undetectable poison would have been enormous. Some apothecaries specialized in the gray area between medicine and poison. They sold substances like arsenic, legitimately used in very small amounts to treat skin diseases and other conditions, but lethal in larger doses. They sold strong purgatives and emetics that, while medicinal in proper amounts, could cause death through dehydration if overdosed. They sold powerful narcotics like opium and henbane. All of these had legitimate uses, but all could be weaponized by someone with malicious intent. The fear of poison was not entirely irrational, but it was certainly amplified by the uncertainty of medieval life. Given the low standards of hygiene, food spoilage and water contamination were common. People died suddenly from natural causes that were not understood. It was often impossible to distinguish between intentional poisoning and food poisoning or waterborne disease. The symptoms were similar. The medical understanding of illness was too limited to make accurate diagnoses. This uncertainty fed paranoia. When someone fell ill unexpectedly, especially someone wealthy or powerful, poison was often suspected. Accusations flew. Enemies were blamed. Apothecaries who had recently provided medicines to the deceased might find themselves accused of having switched a remedy for a toxin. These accusations could destroy a career or lead to execution, even if entirely unfounded. The whole edifice of poison detection, antidotes, and protective measures was built on a foundation of fear and magical thinking, with only occasional support from actual chemical reality. Most of it did not work. Unicorn horns did not detect poison. Bezoars were hit or miss at best. Precious gems had no medical properties. Theriac provided placebo benefits, but not real protection. Yet these practices reveal important truths about medieval society. They show the depth of distrust among the powerful, the constant awareness of mortality, and the desperate search for control in an uncontrollable world. They also show the central role of the apothecary, who stood at the intersection of healing and harming, trusted and feared in equal measure. The apothecary who could promise protection from poison, whether through theriac or bezoar stones or unicorn horn powder, held a kind of power that went beyond mere commerce. He was selling safety, selling hope, selling the illusion of control over death itself. And in the medieval world, no commodity was more precious. Medical theory and the body's humors. To understand the medieval apothecary's work, we must understand the theory that guided it. The medicines compounded behind the apothecary's counter were not random combinations. They were carefully crafted according to a sophisticated, internally consistent, but ultimately incorrect theory of how the human body functioned. This was humoral medicine, a system developed by ancient Greek physicians, refined by their Roman successors, and transmitted to medieval Europe as gospel truth. It was wrong in almost every detail, yet it shaped medical practice for more than 1,000 years. The theory began with Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE and was elaborated by Galen in the 2nd century CE. At its core was a beautiful, elegant idea. The human body, like the universe itself, was composed of 4 fundamental elements: earth, water, air, and fire. These elements manifested in the body as 4 fluids, called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor had specific qualities. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Health was understood as a balance of these 4 humors, maintained in the proper proportions unique to each individual. Disease was fundamentally an imbalance. If one humor became excessive or deficient, the result was illness. The symptoms of disease were manifestations of humoral imbalance. Restoring health meant restoring balance. This theory explained individual differences. People had different temperaments based on which humor predominated in their constitution. A sanguine person, with an excess of blood, was cheerful, optimistic, and sociable, but might be prone to certain illnesses related to heat and moisture. A phlegmatic person, dominated by phlegm, was calm, slow-moving, and unemotional. A choleric individual, with excess yellow bile, was quick-tempered and energetic. A melancholic person, dominated by black bile, was thoughtful, artistic, and prone to sadness. These temperaments were not just personality types. They were fundamental physiological differences that affected what diseases a person might develop and how they should be treated. Treatment consisted of opposing qualities to imbalances. If a disease was caused by excess heat and moisture, as many fevers were thought to be, the treatment was to cool and dry the patient. This might be done through bloodletting, which removed the hot, moist blood, or through prescribing medicines that were classified as cool and dry. Conversely, a disease of cold and dry nature, such as some forms of melancholy, will be treated with hot and moist remedies. Every substance in nature was classified according to these qualities, and the classification was often hierarchical. A substance might be hot in the 1st degree, meaning mildly heating, or hot in the 4th degree, meaning intensely so. The same applied to cold, moist, and dry. An experienced physician or apothecary could navigate this complex system, selecting exactly the right remedy with exactly the right qualities and degree to counteract the specific imbalance affecting the patient. Diagnosis was a subtle art. Physicians did not have modern tools like stethoscopes, blood tests, or x-rays. They relied on observation and questioning. They examined the patient's complexion, tongue, eyes. They felt the pulse, not just for rate, but for quality, attempting to detect dozens of different pulse types that indicated different conditions. Most important, they examined urine. Uroscopy, the analysis of urine, was the primary diagnostic tool of medieval medicine. The urine's color, clarity, sediment, smell, and even taste were all noted and interpreted according to humoral theory. The physician would then write a prescription, specifying which medicines to use, in what proportions, and how to prepare them. This prescription was written in Latin, using standard abbreviations, and taken to an apothecary who would compound the medicine. The apothecary had to understand the theory well enough to properly interpret the prescription and to judge whether the physician's instructions were reasonable or potentially dangerous. The apothecary's knowledge of materia medica, the catalog of medicinal substances, was organized according to humoral qualities. He knew that mint was cooling and drying, useful for hot, moist conditions. He knew that pepper was heating and drying, appropriate for cold, moist ailments. He knew that rose water was cooling and could soothe inflammations, conditions of excess heat. He knew that honey was warming and moistening, good for dry coughs. Some of the humoral classifications seem arbitrary or bizarre to modern understanding, but within the system, they made sense. A plant that tasted bitter was typically classified as cooling and drying because bitterness was associated with yellow bile, which was hot and dry, and the principle of opposites meant bitter things opposed it. A sweet substance was generally heating and moistening. A sour substance was cooling. These taste-based classifications were crude, but provided an easily accessible guide. Beyond the simple model of four humors, medieval medicine incorporated ideas about the vital forces and faculties that animated the body. There was the natural faculty, located in the liver, responsible for nutrition and growth. There was the vital faculty, in the heart, responsible for maintaining life force and distributing heat through the body via the blood. There was the animal faculty, in the brain, responsible for sensation and voluntary movement. Different medicines affected these different faculties. The theory also incorporated ideas about digestion as a kind of internal cooking. Food was thought to be cooked in the stomach by heat from the heart, transforming it into the four humors. Poor digestion meant inadequate cooking, leading to the production of corrupt humors that caused disease. Many medicines were aimed at improving this digestive cooking or at purging the corrupt products. This led to a strong emphasis on purgation as a therapeutic strategy. If disease was caused by bad humors accumulating in the body, the solution was to expel them. This could be done in several ways. Emetics induced vomiting, expelling through the mouth. Purgatives induced diarrhea, expelling through the bowels. Diuretics increased urination, expelling through the bladder. Bloodletting, performed by barber surgeons but sometimes supervised by apothecaries, directly removed blood, thought to carry the excess or corrupt humors. Sweating, induced by sitting in hot rooms or taking certain medicines, expelled through the skin. The apothecary prepared medicines for all these purposes. Emetics included ipecac and white hellebore. Purgatives included senna, aloe, and rhubarb, each with different strengths and uses. Gentle laxatives like prunes were appropriate for children or the elderly. Stronger purgatives were reserved for robust patients with severe conditions. The apothecary had to know which to recommend and in what dose. Bloodletting was ubiquitous. Nearly everyone, sick or healthy, was bled periodically as a preventative measure. The amount taken varied, but it could be substantial, sometimes a pint or more. The theory was that letting blood prevented the accumulation of corrupt humors and maintained balance. In practice, it weakened patients and sometimes killed them, but it was believed to be essential, and apothecaries often participated by recommending when and how much blood should be let. Women's medicine presented special considerations within humoral theory. Women's bodies were thought to be naturally colder and moister than men's, which explained why they menstruated, the body expelling excess cold, moist humors. Disruptions of menstruation were seen as dangerous accumulations of these humors. Apothecaries prepared emmenagogues, medicines designed to bring on the courses or induce menstruation. These included pennyroyal, tansy, and rue. They could also serve as abortifacients, ending pregnancies, though that use was rarely stated openly. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, and various medicines were believed to help. Dittany was thought to ease labor. Raspberry leaf tea was given to strengthen the womb. After birth, various tonics were prescribed to restore the mother's strength and promote milk production. Fennel, dill, and milk thistle were all thought to increase breast milk. Children's medicine was another specialty. Children were seen as naturally hot and moist, their humors imbalanced toward those qualities. As they aged, they would gradually cool and dry, reaching a balanced state in adulthood before cooling and drying further in old age. Medicines for children had to be gentle, accounting for their tender constitutions. Soothing syrups for teething, gentle purgatives for digestive upset, and calming draughts for sleeplessness were common. The apothecary's relationship with physicians was complex and sometimes contentious. Ideally, they worked together. The physician diagnosed and prescribed, the apothecary prepared and dispensed. But in practice, boundaries blurred. Apothecaries, having extensive practical knowledge, often gave medical advice to patients who could not afford a physician's fees. They would ask about symptoms and recommend medicines based on their experience. This encroachment on physicians' territory was a constant source of conflict. Physicians, university-educated and licensed, saw themselves as superior to apothecaries, who were typically trained through apprenticeship and belonged to craft guilds. Physicians wrote in Latin, wore academic robes, and associated with the educated elite. Apothecaries were tradesmen, however skilled. This class distinction created tension, with physicians attempting to regulate apothecaries and restrict their practice to dispensing only, while apothecaries pushed for greater autonomy and recognition of their expertise. In some places, particularly in France, the regulatory framework was strict. The Faculty of Medicine in Paris controlled apothecaries tightly, inspecting their shops, testing their knowledge, and punishing those who overstepped their bounds by attempting to diagnose or prescribe. In England, the situation was more fluid, with apothecaries gradually taking on more medical functions, eventually evolving into general practitioners, the forerunners of modern GPs. Surgeons occupied a middle position in this medical hierarchy. They performed manual procedures, setting bones, lancing boils, removing bladder stones, amputating limbs, and, most commonly, bleeding patients. In many cities, surgeons and barbers belonged to the same guild, as both professions involved sharp instruments and blood. The barber surgeon was a familiar figure, identifiable by the striped pole outside his shop, red and white representing blood and bandages. Apothecaries and surgeons sometimes collaborated, particularly in treating wounds and injuries. The apothecary would prepare ointments, salves, and plasters that the surgeon would apply. They would prepare pain-relieving draughts, typically containing opium, to be given before surgery. This cooperation created professional relationships and sometimes friendships across the theoretical boundary between different branches of medicine. Despite its complete failure to accurately describe human physiology, humoral medicine achieved impressive things. It provided a framework for systematic observation of illness. It encouraged careful record-keeping, with physicians noting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. It created a shared language that allowed medical knowledge to be transmitted across time and space. And within its own logic, it worked often enough, through placebo effects and the occasional lucky coincidence of an effective herbal remedy, to maintain credibility. When humoral medicine finally gave way to modern scientific medicine in the 18th and 19th centuries, it did not vanish overnight. Aspects of it persisted in folk medicine and in popular understanding of health. We still speak of catching a cold, a concept derived from humoral ideas about cold air disturbing the body's balance. We speak of hot-tempered people, of phlegmatic attitudes, of melancholy moods, all echoes of humoral temperaments. The medieval apothecary, standing behind his counter grinding herbs according to a prescription written in humoral terms, believed he was participating in a rational, scientific system of healing. He was wrong about the theory, but he was right about the importance of careful preparation, accurate dosing, and professional expertise. Those principles survived the collapse of humoral medicine and remain the foundation of modern pharmacy. Guild power, regulations, and control. By the 13th century, as apothecaries established themselves in cities across Europe, they faced a fundamental question. How would their profession be organized and regulated? The answer came in the form of the guild system, that quintessentially medieval institution that shaped urban economic life for centuries. For apothecaries, joining or forming guilds was not just about economic advantage. It was about establishing legitimacy, maintaining standards, protecting their market, and claiming their place in the complex hierarchy of urban society. The earliest apothecaries did not have their own guilds. They belonged to guilds of spice merchants, the grocers or pepperers, because their businesses were closely related. Both dealt in imported goods, exotic substances, and aromatic materials. In London, apothecaries were members of the Worshipful Company of Grocers from the 12th century. In Paris, they belonged to the Guild of Spice Merchants Apothecaries. In Italian cities, they were part of the Arte dei Medici, e Speciali, the Guild of Physicians and Apothecaries. This shared membership created both opportunities and tensions. On one hand, the established spice merchant guilds provided institutional infrastructure and political connections. They had relationships with city authorities, rights to certain trading privileges, and established procedures for training apprentices. On the other hand, apothecaries and spice merchants had somewhat different interests. Spice merchants focused on bulk trade and food products. Apothecaries focused on medicinal preparations and wanted regulations specific to pharmaceutical practice. Over time, apothecaries pushed for independence, for their own guilds that would recognize pharmacy as a distinct profession. In 1617, apothecaries in London received royal assent to form the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, separate from the grocers. This was a major milestone, establishing apothecaries as a profession in their own right with their own governance structure. The primary function of these guilds was to regulate who could practice as an apothecary. They established requirements for entry to the profession, primarily through controlling apprenticeship. A boy could not simply decide to become an apothecary. He had to be formally apprenticed to a master apothecary who was a guild member. The guild maintained registers of all apprentices and their masters, creating an official record of the training pipeline. The guild set standards for training. In London, the Society of Apothecaries required 7 years of apprenticeship. The apprentice had to demonstrate competence in identifying herbs, compounding medicines, and reading Latin prescriptions. At the end of the apprenticeship, the guild administered an examination. Only those who passed were allowed to practice as journeyman apothecaries. Becoming a master, with the right to open your own shop and train apprentices, required additional years of practice, and often a separate examination or demonstration of a masterpiece, a particularly complex pharmaceutical preparation. These requirements served multiple purposes. They ensured a basic level of competence, protecting the public from incompetent practitioners. They maintained the prestige of the profession by making entry difficult. And they restricted competition by limiting the number of new apothecaries entering the market. This last point was crucial from the guild's perspective. If anyone could hang out a sign and call themselves an apothecary, the market would be flooded, prices would drop, and existing members would suffer. By controlling entry, the guild maintained the economic viability of the profession. Quality control was another major guild function. In Paris, royal statutes from 1353 established that the Guild of Spice Merchants Apothecaries would conduct regular inspections of member shops. A master of apothecaries, assisted by 2 physicians appointed by the Faculty of Medicine, would visit each shop at least twice a year, carefully examining all the substances to be found therein. They would check that ingredients were properly labeled, that dangerous medicines were not being sold improperly, and that the quality of materials met standards. The 1353 statutes also outlawed the selling of poisonous or dangerous medicines, except under strict controls, mandated that bottles be labeled with the year and month the remedy was prepared so that customers could avoid old, degraded medicines, and instructed apothecaries to sell their products at a loyal, fair, and moderate price, presumably to prevent price gouging during times of epidemic or high demand. In London, the Society of Apothecaries established a chemical laboratory in 1672 for manufacturing and selling drugs to society members. The goal was to control the production of medicines, ensuring quality and consistency. The Society also conducted inspections of apothecary shops within London, attempting to prevent adulteration of pharmaceuticals within city boundaries. Adulteration was a constant concern. Unscrupulous suppliers, or even apothecaries themselves, might dilute expensive substances with cheap fillers to increase profits. Saffron might be mixed with dyed plant material. Theriac might be made with substitute ingredients rather than genuine viper flesh and rare imports. Powdered gems might be counterfeit. The guild inspections aimed to catch such fraud, imposing fines and potentially expelling offenders. Price regulation was controversial. From the guild members' perspective, it protected customers from exploitation. From a broader economic perspective, it was rent-seeking, an attempt to maintain artificially high prices and profits. The Paris statutes calling for loyal, fair, and moderate prices were vague, leaving room for interpretation. Apothecaries likely charged as much as they thought they could get away with while still meeting the letter of these regulations. The guilds provided mutual support and solidarity. Members helped each other in times of hardship. If an apothecary fell ill or died, the guild might provide financial assistance to his family. If a member was falsely accused of malpractice or faced legal trouble, the guild might provide legal support. This collective security was one of the main benefits of membership, and one reason why guilds were so important to medieval craftsmen and merchants. Guilds also served social and religious functions. They often had a patron saint, and members would participate in annual processions and masses honoring that saint. The Guild of St. Luke, which included both apothecaries and artists in many cities because both professions dealt with grinding and mixing pigments, held elaborate ceremonies and sponsored chapels in local churches. These religious activities reinforced the guild's corporate identity and provided a sense of common purpose beyond mere economic interest. The political power of guilds varied by city and region. In some Italian city-states, guilds wielded enormous political influence, essentially controlling the city government. In Florence, guild membership was required for participation in government, and the major guilds dominated political offices. In such systems, being a guild master meant having a voice in how the city was run. In other places, particularly in strongly monarchical states, guilds had less political autonomy, but still could lobby authorities for favorable treatment. They might petition the king or city council for exclusive rights to certain trades, for protection from foreign competition, or for changes in tax policy. The formation of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries in London in 1617 was itself an exercise in political lobbying, with apothecaries petitioning King James I for separation from the grocers. Conflicts between guilds were common. In London, apothecaries fought bitter battles with the Royal College of Physicians over practice boundaries. The physicians, representing university-educated doctors, claimed exclusive rights to diagnose disease and prescribe medicine. They viewed apothecaries as mere tradesmen who should only compound medicines according to physicians' orders. The apothecaries, representing practical experience and serving a broader population, argued that they should be allowed to diagnose and prescribe, especially for patients who could not afford a physician's fees. These disputes played out in courts, in parliament, and in pamphlets and treatises. Physicians published screeds denouncing apothecaries as ignorant quacks. Apothecaries responded by highlighting their extensive practical knowledge and their service to the poor. The physician Christopher Merritt published a short view of the frauds and abuses committed by apothecaries in 1669, cataloging alleged misconduct by apothecaries who exceeded their proper role. Apothecaries fired back with their own publications. The Rose case of 1703 was a watershed moment in this conflict. An apothecary named William Rose treated a patient without a physician's prescription, directly diagnosing and prescribing. The Royal College of Physicians sued him for practicing medicine without a license. The case went all the way to the House of Lords, which ruled in favor of Rose, establishing that apothecaries could indeed diagnose and prescribe, not just compound medicines on others' orders. This legal victory significantly expanded apothecaries' scope of practice and was a major step toward their evolution into general practitioners. Guild regulations also covered training and education beyond apprenticeship. The London Society of Apothecaries organized herborizing expeditions for apprentices and members to study medicinal plants in the field. They established a physic garden, the Chelsea Physic Garden, founded in 1673, specifically for teaching botany to apprentices. This garden became one of the most important botanical gardens in Europe, with collections of rare and exotic plants from around the world. It served as a living library, allowing apothecaries to study plants they might never encounter in dried form. Women's participation in the apothecary profession was heavily restricted by guild rules in most places. Guilds were overwhelmingly male institutions, and apprenticeships were typically only available to boys. However, there were exceptions. Widows of guild members were sometimes allowed to continue operating their husbands' businesses, their years of practical experience in the shop recognized as equivalent to apprenticeship. Some guilds, particularly in Renaissance Italy, had female members, usually nuns whose conventual pharmacies served both their communities and the broader public. In 17th-century London, several women became recognized apothecaries through the widow route. The Widow Wink, Susan Reeve Lyon, and Cross all operated apothecary shops with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of acceptance by the male-dominated profession. Their experiences, documented in court records, show both the possibilities and the limitations for women in pharmacy. They faced harassment from male competitors, accusations of incompetence, and attempts by guilds to restrict their practice. Yet they persisted, some for decades, serving their communities and training the next generation. Guild regulations sometimes specified what apothecaries could and could not sell beyond medicines. Many guilds allowed or even encouraged members to sell artist pigments, cosmetics, perfumes, and other products requiring pharmaceutical skills. Some guilds restricted these sidelines, fearing they would distract from the core medical mission or cheapen the profession's image. The rise of print in the 15th century created new challenges for guild control. With printed pharmacopoeias becoming available, anyone who could read might learn pharmaceutical recipes. Printed herbals allowed people to identify medicinal plants themselves. This democratization of pharmaceutical knowledge threatened guild monopolies. In response, guilds emphasized the importance of practical training, arguing that reading a book was no substitute for years of hands-on experience under a master's supervision. The guild system, for all its faults, did establish pharmacy as a recognized, regulated profession. It created standards of competence, mechanisms for quality control, and ethical frameworks. The guild's insistence on proper training, accurate dosing, and avoidance of adulteration helped protect the public from the worst abuses. The conflicts between guilds and other medical professions, while sometimes petty, also helped define boundaries and responsibilities. When we examine the medieval apothecary through the lens of guild organization, we see a profession caught between competing pressures: the need to maintain exclusivity versus the need to serve a growing urban population, the desire for autonomy versus subordination to physicians, the profit motive versus ethical responsibilities. The guild system was the mechanism through which these tensions were negotiated, imperfectly but consequentially, shaping the development of pharmacy as a distinct branch of medicine. Influence, corruption, and dark secrets. The medieval apothecary occupied a position of peculiar power. He stood at the crossroads of commerce and healing, of public service and private profit, of knowledge and secrecy. This position afforded opportunities for tremendous good, but also for corruption, manipulation, and occasionally, murder. The dark side of the apothecary's trade is a story of poisoners and charlatans, of adulterated medicines and inflated prices, of knowledge weaponized for gain rather than deployed for healing. The most sensational abuse was deliberate poisoning. While most apothecaries were honest practitioners serving their communities faithfully, the profession's knowledge base made it theoretically possible for an apothecary to become a skilled assassin. He knew which plants were lethal. He knew how to extract and concentrate their toxic principles. He knew how to disguise poisons in syrups and medicines. He had access to materials not easily obtained by others. And crucially, he was trusted. When an apothecary handed over a bottle of medicine, people generally did not suspect foul play. In Renaissance Italy, where poisoning reached almost epidemic levels among the wealthy and powerful, apothecaries were inevitably implicated. Some were willing, for the right price, to prepare poisons for customers intent on murder. The transaction would be conducted in whispers, the poison disguised as something innocuous, payment made in cash that left no record. The apothecary took terrible risks. If caught, he faced execution, usually by burning. But the potential rewards were enormous. A single commission to prepare an undetectable poison for a wealthy client, eliminating a rival or an inconvenient spouse, might bring more money than a year of legitimate business. We know about these cases primarily through trial records and accusations. Actual convictions were relatively rare, as proving poisoning was difficult without modern forensic methods. But the accusations themselves reveal the fear and suspicion surrounding the profession. When someone of importance died suddenly, suspicion often fell on the apothecaries who had recently provided medicines. Even innocent practitioners could find their reputations destroyed by mere rumor. The most common form of corruption, however, was not murder but fraud. Adulteration of medicines, selling cheap substitutes for expensive ingredients, was a persistent problem. An apothecary might make a large batch of theriac using substitute ingredients cheaper than the genuine viper flesh, rare resins, and exotic spices called for in the proper recipe. He could sell this counterfeit theriac as the genuine article, pocketing the difference in cost. Customers could not easily detect the fraud, and if the medicine proved ineffective, any number of explanations could be offered. The patient's condition was too advanced, the stars were unfavorable, the patient had not followed directions properly. Saffron was particularly prone to adulteration. Genuine saffron was extraordinarily expensive, produced from the hand-picked stigmas of crocus flowers. Unscrupulous suppliers would mix true saffron with dyed plant material to increase volume. An apothecary who was not careful in selecting suppliers might innocently purchase and resell adulterated saffron. An apothecary who was himself unscrupulous might deliberately adulterate his own stock. The guild inspection system was designed to catch such fraud, but inspectors could be bribed, and clever fraudsters could hide their adulteration until after inspection. The same applied to precious gems, bezoar stones, and unicorn horn. There was a thriving market in fake bezoars, artificially constructed concretions sold as the genuine article. Narwhal tusks were sold as unicorn horn at inflated prices. But even that was honest compared to selling ordinary cattle horn or crafted ivory as unicorn horn. The apothecary dealing in such rarities had to be both expert and ethical to avoid defrauding customers, and not all were either. Price manipulation was another issue. During plague outbreaks, when demand for theriac and other supposed preventatives spiked, some apothecaries raised their prices dramatically. This was market economics, supply and demand. But it was also exploitation of desperate, terrified people. Guild regulations against such practices existed, but were difficult to enforce. How could one determine what price was fair and moderate during an emergency? The relationship between apothecaries and physicians created opportunities for corrupt collaboration. A physician might have an arrangement with a particular apothecary. The physician would write prescriptions sending patients to that apothecary, and the apothecary would give the physician a kickback, a percentage of the sales. This arrangement was illegal under most guild regulations and medical ethics, but it was difficult to prove and probably not uncommon. Physicians might also prescribe unnecessarily expensive or complex medicines when simpler remedies would suffice, knowing that their apothecary partner would benefit from the larger sale. Or they might prescribe medicines the patient did not really need, essentially inventing illnesses to generate revenue. The patient, trusting the physician's expertise, would have no way to know they were being defrauded. Some apothecaries practiced a less malicious but still problematic form of deception: the promotion of useless or marginally effective remedies as cure-alls. The human tendency to seek miraculous cures, to believe in simple solutions to complex problems, created a market for dubious medicines. An apothecary with a talent for persuasive salesmanship could make a fortune selling expensive placebos to gullible customers. The line between legitimate medicine and quackery was often blurry. Medieval medicine was largely ineffective by modern standards, and distinguishing between an expensive medicine that did nothing and a cheap one that did equally nothing was difficult. But some remedies were clearly fraudulent, promoted with testimonials and spectacular claims that had no basis in reality. Apothecaries who engaged in such salesmanship were essentially con artists, exploiting hope and fear for profit. Not all influence wielded by apothecaries was malicious. Some used their position and knowledge for genuine public benefit. During plague outbreaks, apothecaries were often at the forefront of providing care, dispensing medicines, and advising the public on preventative measures. They risked their own lives in doing so, as close contact with plague victims was dangerous. Many apothecaries died in epidemics, killed by the very diseases they sought to treat. Apothecaries also served as community advisors on a range of health matters. People came to them for advice on diet, on hygiene, on child-rearing. The good apothecary was a source of wisdom and reassurance, someone who could explain what was happening when illness struck and what could be done about it. This role required not just pharmaceutical knowledge, but also judgment, empathy, and communication skill. The wealthiest apothecaries became important figures in their cities, serving on city councils, funding religious institutions, and patronizing the arts. They were respected members of the urban elite, their shops prominent fixtures in commercial districts. Their influence extended beyond medicine into civic life. In Renaissance Florence, members of the Arte dei Medici especially held significant political power, and several prominent politicians and patrons had trained as apothecaries. However, this very influence created potential for corruption at a civic level. An apothecary with political connections might use them to influence regulations in his favor, to secure monopolies on certain medicines, or to disadvantage competitors. The intertwining of economic, professional, and political power made guild politics Byzantine in complexity, with alliances formed and broken, favors traded, and reputations made or destroyed. The secret recipes held by individual apothecaries were a form of intellectual property and a source of competitive advantage. An apothecary might develop a particularly effective cough syrup or a popular digestive tonic. He would guard the recipe jealously, sharing it only with trusted apprentices or family members who would continue the business. These secrets were valuable assets, sometimes specified in wills and inheritance documents. But secrecy could also hide malpractice. If an apothecary claimed his secret remedy cured plague and charged exorbitant prices for it, who could challenge him if the recipe was unknown? He might be selling nothing more than spiced wine, but without knowing the ingredients, customers could not evaluate his claims. The cult of secrecy in pharmaceutical preparation, while protecting legitimate intellectual property, also provided cover for fraud. In 1593, a Florentine apothecary named Stefano Rosselli wrote down his secrets in a book for his sons, a collection of recipes and techniques he had developed or learned over his career. Such books, when they survive, provide invaluable insights into actual practice, revealing the gap between official pharmacopoeias and what was actually done in the shop. Some of Rosselli's secrets were genuine innovations. Others were dubious at best. The mixture of the legitimate and the questionable was typical of the profession. The medieval apothecary's power rested on specialized knowledge in an age when literacy was limited and access to information restricted. He knew things others did not. This knowledge gap created both opportunity and temptation. The ethical apothecary used his knowledge to heal. The corrupt apothecary used it to exploit. Most, undoubtedly, fell somewhere between these extremes, trying to make a living and serve their communities while navigating the moral ambiguities of a profession that dealt in substances that could both cure and kill. The legacy of this era includes both the genuine advancement of pharmaceutical practice and the shadows of corruption and abuse. The guild regulations, inspections, and professional standards that emerged were responses to real problems. They were attempts to ensure that the power wielded by apothecaries was used responsibly. They did not always succeed, but they established principles that remain relevant. The importance of competence, the need for transparency, the requirement for ethical behavior, and the understanding that those who hold the power to heal also hold the power to harm and must be held accountable for how they use that power. Legacy and transformation. The medieval apothecary's shop, with its rows of ceramic jars, its smells of herbs and chemicals, its master in long robes weighing powders on precision scales, seems impossibly distant from a modern pharmacy. The bright-lit drug store with its rows of plastic bottles, its computer terminals and insurance forms, its pharmacist in a white coat behind a high counter, appears to have nothing in common with its medieval ancestor. Yet the connections are there, visible to those who look closely. The modern pharmacy is the direct descendant of the medieval apothecary shop, and many practices, tools, and even symbols have been inherited across the centuries. The transformation began in the 17th and 18th centuries, as the scientific revolution gradually undermined the theoretical foundations of medieval medicine. Humoral theory, that elegant but incorrect system that had guided practice for over 1,000 years, began to crumble. Physicians and natural philosophers started to understand the body differently, as a mechanical system rather than a balance of mystical fluids. They began to question whether bloodletting and purgation were always beneficial. They began to demand experimental proof rather than accepting ancient authorities uncritically. This scientific shift forced apothecaries to adapt. The old classifications of medicines as hot or cold, moist or dry, lost credibility. New systems of understanding drug action emerged, based on observation and experimentation rather than philosophical theory. Chemistry, developing as a science in its own right, provided new tools for analyzing and preparing medicines. The apothecary, who had been primarily an artisan, following recipes handed down through generations, needed to become something more like a scientist. The invention of new medicines drove this transformation. In the 17th century, cinchona bark from South America, containing quinine, proved dramatically effective against malaria. This was a genuine, specific cure, effective against a particular disease in a way that theriac and mithridate had never been. It demonstrated that individual substances could have powerful, targeted effects, undermining the panacea concept that had dominated medieval medicine. The isolation of pure alkaloids from plants, beginning in the 19th century, accelerated the shift. Morphine was isolated from opium in 1804. Quinine was isolated from cinchona bark in 1820. Atropine from belladonna, cocaine from coca, dozens of others followed. These pure substances could be standardized, dosed precisely, and studied scientifically in ways that crude plant extracts could not. The rise of synthetic chemistry created a new category of drugs that had no medieval precedent. Medicines manufactured in laboratories from raw chemicals rather than extracted from plants or animals. Aspirin, synthesized in 1897, was among the first blockbuster synthetic drugs. It was more effective, more consistent, and easier to manufacture than the traditional willow bar preparations. The 20th century saw an explosion of synthetic drugs, sulfa antibiotics, penicillin and other antibiotics, vaccines, hormones, psychotropic medications. Pharmacy increasingly became a science of industrial chemistry rather than of preparing herbal extracts. This transformation reduced the compounding role of pharmacists. Where medieval apothecaries spent most of their time preparing medicines from raw materials, modern pharmacists increasingly dispense pre-manufactured pills and capsules produced by pharmaceutical companies. The pestle and mortar became decorative symbols rather than daily tools. The rows of storage jars, once essential working equipment, became museum pieces. However, the professional identity of the pharmacist as medicine expert persisted and strengthened. Modern pharmacists are highly educated, holding doctoral degrees in pharmacy. They are licensed by state boards and held to strict professional standards. They serve as advisors to both physicians and patients on drug therapy. They check for drug interactions, monitor dosing, and counsel patients on proper use of medications. This role as expert intermediary between the prescriber and the patient, between medical science and public health, is a direct continuation of the medieval apothecary's role. The physical layout of pharmacies retains echoes of the past. The counter that separates the pharmacist from customers, the shelves of stored medications visible behind, the consultation area where private conversations can occur, all these have medieval precedents. The modern pharmacy, like the medieval apothecary shop, is both a retail space and a professional consultation room. Even some symbols have survived across the centuries. The mortar and pestle remain the international symbol of pharmacy, appearing on the logos of pharmacy organizations and on pharmacy signs worldwide. The bowl of Hygeia, a cup with a snake entwined around it, combines ancient symbols with the medieval mortar shape. The RX abbreviation on prescriptions comes from the Latin word recipe, take thou, the traditional opening of a medical prescription in medieval times. The professional organizations of pharmacists are the descendants of medieval guilds. They set standards for education and practice. They advocate for the profession's interests. They provide continuing education and professional development. They enforce ethical standards. These functions mirror what the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries or the Parisian Guild of Spice Merchants Apothecaries did centuries ago. The legal and regulatory frameworks governing pharmacy also have medieval roots. The requirement for licensure, the prohibition on selling certain drugs without prescription, the standards for purity and labeling, the inspections to prevent adulteration, all these trace back to guild regulations and royal statute from the medieval and early modern periods. The modern pharmaceutical regulatory state, with agencies like the FDA overseeing drug safety and efficacy, is vastly more sophisticated, but the basic principle that medicines must be controlled to protect public health was established in the medieval city. The ethical tensions faced by modern pharmacists also have medieval precedents. How to balance profit with service, how to handle pressure from physicians or insurers to do things that might not be in patients' best interests, how to maintain professional autonomy while working within larger commercial or healthcare systems. These were all issues that medieval apothecaries grappled with. The solutions have evolved, but the fundamental challenges remain. What we have lost in the transition from medieval to modern pharmacy is perhaps the holistic character of the medieval apothecary's role. The medieval apothecary was doctor, pharmacist, shopkeeper, and community advisor all in one. The modern healthcare system has fragmented these roles. Physicians diagnose and prescribe. Pharmacists dispense and advise on medications. Shopkeepers sell consumer goods. Health coaches and nutritionists advise on wellness. This specialization has brought improvements in expertise and efficiency, but has also created coordination problems and gaps in care. Some knowledge from medieval pharmacy has proven valid and has been incorporated into modern practice. Many herbal remedies that medieval apothecaries used have been vindicated by scientific research. Willow bark does contain aspirin-like compounds. Foxglove does contain digitalis. Certain molds do produce antibiotics. Garlic does have antimicrobial properties. Modern pharmacognosy, the study of drugs derived from natural sources, continues the work that medieval apothecaries began. Much medieval knowledge, however, has been discarded. Theriac is no longer manufactured. Unicorn horn is recognized as narwhal tusk and not used medicinally. Bezoar stones are curiosities. Bloodletting has been abandoned, except in very specific conditions. The elaborate humoral classifications of medicines as hot or cold have been replaced by understanding of actual chemical mechanisms. This discarding of incorrect beliefs has been necessary for medical progress. Yet we should not be too quick to dismiss all medieval pharmaceutical practice as superstition. The medieval apothecary, working with the knowledge available in his time, attempting to help suffering people with the tools and theories at his disposal, was not a fool or a charlatan in most cases. He was doing his best within the constraints of his era. Some of his remedies worked, though often for reasons he did not understand. Some did not work, but provided comfort through placebo effect. Some caused harm, particularly the aggressive purgation and bloodletting. But the fundamental impulse, to use natural substances to heal, was sound, and the methods of careful preparation, accurate measurement, and systematic record-keeping were valid practices that modern pharmacy has preserved and refined. The story of the medieval apothecary is ultimately a story about the development of a profession, about the slow accumulation of knowledge through practice and observation, about the establishment of ethical standards and regulatory frameworks, and about the enduring human need for healers who possess specialized knowledge about medicines. When we walk into a modern pharmacy and receive a prescription from a licensed pharmacist who has studied for years to master the science of medications, we are participating in a tradition that stretches back through the worshipful society of apothecaries in 17th century London, through the guild of spice merchants in medieval Paris, through the monastic pharmacies of the early Middle Ages, all the way back to the ancient physicians of Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia who first learned to harness the healing power of plants. The medieval apothecary, standing in his shop beneath the sign of the mortar and pestle, grinding herbs to prepare a remedy for a sick child, was part of this long chain of healers. His work was imperfect, limited by the knowledge of his time, but it was genuine and important. He controlled life and death, quite literally, through the medicines he prepared. He wielded this power, in most cases, with as much integrity and skill as he possessed. His legacy is the modern pharmacy, refined by centuries of scientific advancement, but still fundamentally dedicated to the same goal, using medicines to heal the sick and ease suffering. So if this long journey through the shadowed doorways and chemical-scented rooms of medieval apothecary shops has intrigued you, if you've found value in understanding how our pharmaceutical traditions were born in an era of guilds and humors and unicorn horns, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These deep dives into the origins of our modern world, these expeditions into the complex truths behind simple assumptions, they're only possible because of viewers like you who appreciate history told honestly and thoroughly. Let me know in the comments what aspect of medieval medical practice you found most surprising, or what topic you'd like us to explore next. Until then, may your nights be peaceful and your rest restorative. Good night.